Hello. Friday afternoon, mid to late April 2023. Well, today I thought I would follow up on reading, as we've been reading Cirlot's Dictionary of Symbols a little bit, and with regards to a bit of meaning, truth, and God, which is about the technical philosophy and understanding these things in a modern setting. About the continuum hypothesis, that a continuum of things often represents, the whole, the universe, the what it is, the what for. After reading Nozick's philosophical explanations, where he describes that after the fundamental question metaphysics, why is there something rather than nothing, that we get into above this nihilism and at the same time get out of and into the Eastern's nihilism, which results an outspring, a wellspringing of things. That there is some interesting reading of the Dictionary of Symbols with regards to metaphor and the strong metonymy, which is about how metaphor fails. That then some of these readings on deconstruction are pretty relevant, because it's an attempt to address what is the thinking and feeling, the phenomenological and the sensational about the metaphor and poetry and poesis, and how we basically have only a metaphor to explain things, and then our abstraction is at its key utter extreme is this strong metonymy, and it goes through Plato's ideals and its metonymy. That at the same time, for something like Plato's ideals, the mathematical objects, that we view them in abstraction, that everything we find, we can see a shape or a form in it, yet as well that's always so distant, only is so related by what is our language in the middle, that it's all zeros and ones up there, and all zeros and ones down there, and all true and false in here, and in the middle, as about how we can relate and relay these things. So first, this deconstructive criticism, Leitch's advanced introduction is pretty good. Two perennial questions: what is a text and what is interpretation? That, in his preface, is what he describes that this book is about. At the end of the interpretive activity, the text is more or less intelligible because all elements appear tied together and unified. As a mode of textual theory and analysis, contemporary deconstruction subverts almost everything in the tradition, putting in question received ideas of the sign and language, the text, the context, the author, the reader, the role of history, the work of interpretation, and the forms of critical writing. In this project, a past crumbles and something monstrous emerges, a future. So he's kind of describing, this notions of looking at things from the ends and being objective and being abstract and considering oneself abstract in the personhood and the way that things are and how things are. That he goes on to read something like, he was talking about Heidegger and Spanos undergo careful exposition to balance the discussion of semiology, and the semiotics is the interpretation and phenomenology of things, for Saussure and Barthes, and about Hayden White, Harold Bloom, Michel Foucault, culminating discussion of various contemporary strategies designed to subvert traditional ideas about historical contextualization. Now, you often see such language in the postmodern deconstructive about how it's subverting things. But in a sense, it's just making a case for abduction or the abstraction of things. And that it is simply, insofar as trying to lay itself at odds with the canon or with the critical analysis or with the intended meaning of the text vis-a-vis the received meaning of the text, because someone who writes is not the same person usually who reads it, or as the case may be, that the usual matters of personal abstract thought are as directly given and received at once, that at the same time one's own ponderings and considerings of their own utterances is at least that first layer of abstraction, hopefully consciously, that when you're talking to yourself, someone's listening. You. So tangled up does de Man get in the epistemological abysses of figurative play that he never quite arrives at history. He tells us in the opening lines of Allegories of Reading that the complexities of reading keep him from history. He suspects that Derrida's historical notion of logocentrism is a fiction, a productive narrative frame for reading. This absence of intertextual materials and determinants distinguishes de Man's critical writing, as does his labyrinthine wanderings amid figural turns and returns. The blind alley is almost the whole of the diminished truth for him. Deconstruction insists on performing what cannot be performed, reading texts. Necessarily, then, allegory aptly characterizes critical misreading and writing. Meanwhile, the historical dimension rests on the back burner. It reminds me, the other day I picked up a book on Polybius, and it's one of the histories of Polybius, who was a Roman or so, as he came over the Aegean and in the times of the Roman Empire, and in the era when Hannibal marched on Rome and defeated Flamininus and this kind of thing. And what it gets into is Polybius's defense of the Roman constitution. And so it's an ethical treatise, and as in the preface of it went, it was one of the first universal histories, because it kind of related what the notion of a universal history is, a world history. And everybody knows the saying, those who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it. Or those who don't know their history may be surprised that it's the history that was already there that's repeated in different words, and it's the same stories. Whether that's comforting or whether that's removed is another thing. That this notion of it being a universal history is, in a sense, at least advised in the sense that it's not exclusive of anything. There's Aborigines in Australia. They have certain rituals. They're not excluded. As part of the text, is maybe not the centrality of the walkabout or something like that, but it's not so absent from it, just as an example, as a universal history of a one world thing. Now, of course, by now it's exclusionary about, well, what about the aliens? What about the angels? What about everything that lives under the sea? And it's like, well, this is a universal human history in a sense, in a terrestrial setting of, the 21st century, and it's not an unusual thing. So in that sense, there's some notions of the deconstructive that, having achieved their own success, outmode themselves. At the same time, the very act of the deconstructionism is very important to factor out the things, to separate what are the concerns, to result what are the independent concerns, to make for any matter of reasoning about things, to understand the fundamentals as they're separated, and then the gestalt, or the togetherness, when something is more than the sum of its parts, about how those combinations result, that extension, the projection, that these are the sorts of things that reflection results, that introspection becomes, after a model of reason, reflection on reason, which can be a very usual thing. And it can also be simply for pleasure and the poetical and the rhetorical and the metaphorical with regards to those being pleasing things. Kind of like Einstein the other day made a quote, something about people are motivated by pleasure and fear. Those are pleasing things. Critical reading, like the making of history, is monumentalization. Randomness is brought to order. Language is the agent. We are bystanders. Allegory triumphs. Reading as disfiguration, as activity that accepts randomness to the very extent that it resists historicism, turns out to be historically more reliable than the products of historical archaeology. Though perhaps too self-consciously paradoxical, this statement justifies and explains de Man's critical practice. To read closely in the deconstructive or disfigurative manner produces more reliable history than the history of historicists and archaeologists who champion carefully forged lies of order and continuity. While de Man never deliberately gets to history in the old sense, he does so inevitably through the work of disfiguration. So he seems to take a stance against, and I don't necessarily, against the interpretation of historical events as necessarily received wisdom, that whatever we have so deemed as historical is thus as of greater import, as a legend, or as what already is, and so that what will be is immaterial. But it can be looked at the other way, that it's only simply a form of ancestor worship. That all that really is it's kind of like the "we were here" mark And when you read something that says we were here, it's acknowledged that we are here together. Disfiguration, and the idea of what's received then to be seen through a lens and not necessarily destroyed. Deconstructionism isn't necessarily destruction or disfigurement. Deconstructionism is making copies, basically, and the being able to see the copies through each of various lenses variously, and this kind of thing, to that it's not for Descartes in his discourse on method, which I'm so reminded because it's here in my vision, that my eyes see it. It's not just a book, it's a reading, it's a text, it's a historical artifact. It's Descartes, the school of a man. So, in that sense, ancestor worship of the sort is to be revered as much as it can be for the angry, cynical postmodernist who is, in some senses, that's a fair reaction to perceived tyranny of what's otherwise to be received as via authority. That's only a manner of coping. And so deconstruction is not necessarily postmodern in the sense of rejection. It's possible to have deconstruction and the postmodern and the acceptance of rejection as confluence, as that's itself only yet another modern historical artifact, and something that reflects a free-thinking variety is very much well valued, because it affects, at least there is a debate that when it comes to thrashing things about, and the idea that there are norms and there are abstractly, objectively either side of norms, that's just a usual thing. So we can see some of the radicals on either side of deconstruction theory, as in there is none and there is all, as simply the usual fallacy of the overgeneralization, and that rules are exceptions to none. That axiomless natural deduction is profound, and then that it's okay. So in this sense, it's possible to have a return to monism while still not being exclusionary of radical postmodern deconstructionist disfigurists. For that to them, we are simply aborigines on a walkabout or along such lines, and vice versa. The reader moves on once again to find another more stable foundation. The reader must then seek the literal base elsewhere in a constant lateral transfer with no resting place in the unequivocally literal, the mimetic, the exact rock, cured at last. Miller characterized the productions of such reading acts as mise en abîme, and he depicts the process of reading itself as lateral dance. This is as for a literary critic, what with regards to what is the allegorical, what is the poetical, what is the metaphorical. But this is where J. Hillis Miller has it, that for Miller, all interpretation is misinterpretation. That's fair. It's not necessarily wrong, though. It's just interpretation is just not necessarily exactly as the author portrayed to convey or conveyed to portray. It's approximate. To read is to connect elements and construct patterns out of the diffused materials in a writing. As a reader works through the chain of words in a text, he or she imposes meaning in an act of willed mastery or submission. It's voluntary. Texts are unreadable or undecidable in that they allow a host of potential misreadings. This is where there's room for generous reading, or reading for content, or reading for information, or reading for comprehension, or reading for analysis, reading for criticism, reading for literary criticism, vis-a-vis reading for pleasure. To reduce a text to a correct or single homogeneous reading is to restrain the free play of its elements. This indeed is one of the roles of mathematics, to provide that there's a single fixed reading, a formal, rigorous, well-defined, well-behaved system of tautologies, equalities, identities that so result for intentionality and extensionality that we can formally array for each other the pleasure of communications that result. There is at least one such notion where then instruction and direction and express intent are so explicit that that's just a use of text. There are others. This does not mean, emphasizes Miller, for whom all interpretation is misinterpretation, that the narrator or the reader is free to give the narrative any meaning he wishes, but that the pattern is subject to free play, is formally undecidable. This is to be argued. After the era of Gödel and the indecidability of theory strong enough to express arithmetic, like ordinary regular set theory, a lot of people have adopted that as the 20th century nadir. But then when we get on to Quine and Popper, W.V.O. Quine and Karl Popper, who were philosophers and started to address turning that back over, in a sense, what was the regular and ordinary, it can be seen that Gödel's incompleteness results that a theory strong enough to express its own consistency or completeness is lacking either one or the other. And so that if it's strong enough to be consistent, it's not complete, and it's strong enough to be complete, it's not consistent. So some will have that such theories can never work out. And others, for example, can have that, well, in our limited means of words and resources and time, that there are some problems that are intractable. But at the same time, via deduction, it can be arrived at that there's a universe up above that. This theory doesn't have a universe. Okay, well, our theory does. This where there are these extraordinary objects that exist in the same theory, that it makes for that why infinity is real in the numbers because it was already there, and this kind of thing. It makes a continuum, which is in the language of the digital and the usual finite combinatorics, is only as approximated. So we can again read the deconstructionist rhetoric of these postmodern literary critics as reflecting that there is a real continuum for them that otherwise this milieu does not afford to offer. Besides that, there's the direct connection of the reading and the intent and the poetry is usually as what they find is the highest in value literarily. That is yet direct, vis-a-vis sensation and connection and this kind of thing. One of Miller's tactics in reading a text is to trace the meaning of a keyword back to its etymological roots. Well, there's roots and then there's usage, and there are both. In so doing, he shifts the apparent stability of the master term out of a closed system and into an ongoing bifurcating labyrinth, or into its garden, kind of like when we were reading about the labyrinth in Cirlot's Symbols the other day. That some have it as the maze where there's the Minotaur, and eventually, if you don't leave yourself a way out and bring something to slay the Minotaur and find your way back out, that you're doomed like everyone before Theseus to die in the labyrinth of the Minotaur. But the others have it as just an ongoing garden, or like the steam rooms that go on forever and are always clean and comfortable, and this kind of thing. That it's only engaged in as a matter of abstraction and a dream state or imagination, that it so dissolves. It's great. The effect of such semantic dissemination is to deracinate the text, revealing the inexhaustible possibilities for interpretation and the futility of logical and dialectical orderings. See, this can be disagreed because it's exactly this process of what it's doing. It's dialectical. This is why deconstruction is kind of like Zen. At a koan, as read what was just read, a koan, it's not Zen. Such a poem is incapable of being encompassed in a single logical formulation. Calls forth potentially endless commentaries, each one of which, like this essay, can only formulate and reformulate its mise en abîme, its place in the abysmal. So that's usually kind of, what would be the word? Macabre. Some people have that art is sex and death. Others that it's any matter of positive representation. Others that they don't know what it is. Others that's what they like. Art is an expression or an interpretation. The metaphor of the dance reveals for us, this is Miller's notion of the lateral dance, which is his conscientious making fit a course without necessarily gaining an attachment. The metaphor of the dance reveals for us in the moves in the act of interpretation, insofar as a text is a specialized tapestry of myriad interlocking threads. For example, words, images, characters, themes, it is constituted as level, meaning that no spot or passage can rise above any other. Nothing may be privileged, there can be no origin, no end, no focus, no priority element, no sovereign principle. To the extent that a text is a temporal chain of interwoven elements, the reader can only transfer elements from one sequence to another, stopping now and then at will to confer meaning through an arbitrary act of interpretation. There can be no true explanation or meaning of the text, only more or less vital patterns of textual connections. Thus, the dance of deconstruction is structured like all dances, repetition, yet such repetition is ultimately liberated and hollowed out by difference. The parallel here with contemporary dancing is remarkably strong. After the waltz, we have the swinger's solo, and at the disco, the music never stops. The dancers merely walk off when they've had enough. Well, people read for various reasons, and reading for pleasure is a thing, and reading for learning is another thing. And some people just skip right to the end because they know in the sequence that there's procedural elements, and they do or don't really care about the middle. While the subversion of logocentric metaphysics has always been a part of the tradition of this misconfiguration deconstruction, the putting in question of metaphysics has taken a novel turn in modern times with new concepts of language, new ideas of structure, and new notions of interpretation. It's difficult to believe that's so. In a sense, that's something old is new again, or something like that. The shadowmen of our traditions are known, if not loved. One knows the familiar litany of the names of these doubters, underminers of the Occidental tradition in its economic and political theory, in its ethical and ontological notions, in its concept of human psychology, and in its theory of language, Marx, Nietzsche, Freud, Saussure. Well, I'm somewhat familiar with something from each of these usual thinkers of sorts, but I don't necessarily see them as apolitical or as sound. And Freud was rather a nut and quite an addict. Not that there's anything necessarily wrong with that, and he had some great output, and he's been of great influence, but I don't know, and I just don't know much about Saussure. We can add to this tradition many other practitioners of deconstruction from earlier eras and from our own time. You can pretty much add anybody who's an abstract thinker. Then for the fact that they might otherwise have to bear some burden of either kowtowing or bowing down to otherwise authority to avoid persecution or death or along those lines, or that they're just simply gentle to their gentle readers so that a generous reading or an ingenerous reading can come across as not insulting to their intelligence or to their expected interpretations and their perceptions. That he's basically describing that there's an importance for the radical and the controversial that's also heralds new concepts or ways of being that basically heralds change or sort. So he's basically saying that he's for progressives, because progressives aren't necessarily going forward or in the future. They just want to be in front of the curve, basically, is how I kind of see that. With respect to that, sometimes it's because they don't want to be behind it anymore, and other times it's because they want to get there first. And so I don't really consider myself so much a progressive as that the curve comes around, and we all progress, which is a different thing. Because what will be, and what already is, but the future is not yet written. The tradition of difference within our culture, as Miller depicts it, appears a conserving force, which ultimately renews and preserves the culture by retrieving repressed materials. This archaeological thrust of deconstruction, initiated earlier with Derrida, is too rarely recognized or omitted. Thus does an imaginary bull metamorphose into a fox, who raids the resources circumspectly, precipitating a rearrangement of the old guard. Now, at the same time, this is, reflected usually in the social undercurrents, and the political undercurrents, the moral undercurrents, and ethical undercurrents of philosophy. Really, from my perspective, I'm a technical philosopher, so even such things as my ethics and morals pretty much arrive from my practical philosophy, which is about my technical philosophy, which is mostly as a reasoning agent, or at least insofar as that every sensory, perceptual, thinking being is an emotional being, that reflects, as Einstein put it, for example, pleasure and fear, or the positive and negative, or as these things various may be so, and what we assert or what we voluntarily submit to, or what we otherwise address as decisions and choice and free will, and that makes it so that, again, any abstraction of thinking about things and the very act of criticism is not necessarily so as solely the skeptics or cynics, because it's a usual essay on any kind of thinking terms. What, in summary, are the means and ends of deconstructions in Miller's project? And here I'd flipped about 190 pages into the book, so this is something that the author, Leitch, had, he really built up to. And for example, before he's talking about Derrida about halfway here, and Riddell and Derrida, and constructing his response to Miller about Derrida, spaniels, and riddles, continuously surfaces such a version of textuality distinct from Heidegger's, Derrida's, Spanos's, and Riddle's, continuously surfaces in the deconstructive works of Miller and Deman, causing various complaints and critiques. That deconstructive theory is not necessarily so the postmodern as that just as aptly the next wave would be its counter. It's not necessarily a contrarian stance to be a postmodern deconstructivist. For example, a modern constructivist. An open-minded modern constructivist. Yet deconstructive discourse can never reach a clarity which is not vulnerable to being deconstructed in its turn. Well, that's very similar to what I just said here a couple pages later, and so I kind of agree with it. Or in Miller's words from the Yale Manifesto, the deconstructive reading can by no means free itself from the metaphysical reading it means to contest. Yeah, very well said. Unable to go beyond language, the deconstructor is compelled to use the concepts and figures of the metaphysical tradition. Thus, he cannot construct a trope-free critical discourse, neither can he get to an undifferentiated literal bottom in the text he reads. Well, then there's a text that's not written, axiomalist natural deduction. This is the usual object of nothing in being that Kant and Hegel provide for us, free for us to deconstruct at our leisure and will. Impasse, endpoint, allegory, aporia. The outside is only an alluring illusion. With its abiding concern for coping with logocentrism and for employing the energies of difference, difference. Miller bears almost no resemblance to Deman. His regular insistence on the self-deconstructive and allegorical structures of writing and his obsession with tracking figural oscillations distinguish his methods from Derrida's. Derrida was a champion of what's called like Dadaism and nihilism and the existentialists and these other significant philosophical schools of the early 20th century. In other words, Miller's enterprise, an original blend, differs markedly from his two colleagues. Unlike de Man, he stays ever attentive to and involved with history. For him, critical reading by nature is archaeological activity. There can be no back burner for history. Unlike Derrida, Miller denies the attractive illusion and paradoxical necessity of a revolutionary change of ground. In effect, he does not believe in split writing, or his disbelief vacillates. The conscientious suspension of disbelief is conscientiously accomplished with the suspension, and vacillating the disbelief. The logocentric systematics, embodying its nihilistic shadow, carries within itself the resources for deconstruction. The logocentric systematics, embodying its nihilistic shadow, carries within itself the resources for deconstruction. In reconstruction, that which is utterly deconstructed again, is reconstructed. The monstrous future, the coming new paradigm, the non-logocentric and apocalyptic outside, which played a role in Derrida's early vision of deconstruction, hold no place in Miller's program. He proclaims no new day, implies no messianic hope, propounds no monstrous future. We have to look forward to something. The historical and radical Nietzschean joy, characteristic of much early French deconstruction, suggestive of revolutionary endeavors, appears infrequently in Miller's works. When it does, the manic tone veers towards depression and the radical edge gets blunted. Deconstruction attempts to resist the totalizing and totalitarian tendencies of criticism. Or at least it attempts to be thorough and open-ended. But in this logocentrism, decentric, but not necessarily not the dialectic. From my perspective, I added those words. It attempts to resist its own tendencies to come to rest in some sense of mastery over the work. It resists these in the name of an uneasy joy of interpretation beyond nihilism, always in the movement, a going beyond which remains in place. The joy of a beyond, of the inconceivable yet promising outside, makes Miller uneasy. For him, any beyond is already in place inside. Repetition replaces revolution. Not necessarily. Deconstruction has always been with us. Plato did it in The Sophist. That's history. No going beyond it. And that's the end of that chapter. And the next chapter starts from codes to lexias, or packets of notation. It talks about Barth's S over Z boasts a sweeping dust jacket assessment by Susan Sontag. S over Z demonstrates once again that Roland Barthes is the most inventive, elegant, and intelligent of contemporary literary critics. These are nice reviews. Most suggestive book I've ever read about why I have ever read a book. Laudatory. S over Z is often serves as the model of practical structuralist analysis. More recently, has been regarded as something of an early deconstructive text that pushes past various limitations of structuralism. Our commentary furthers this view. Into greater truths of structuralism, he describes lexias, variable units of reading, being etched out and examined consecutively for connotative significance. I don't necessarily read linearly. I tend to scan what's in front of me and just pick up and go, and then scan linearly, but in blocks or columns. Third, 93 causeries reflecting something on the lexias. And codes, and sometimes on more general literary and critical matters, are deployed much like conventional book sections. And fourth, two appendices, one a chronological list of action sequences and the other a topic outline key to the causeries, are offered in a gesture, a sketch of summation. So he's describing a criticism of a work as for breaking it down, and as we would first do with dependency grammars and diagramming sentences. pulling out concepts, making a glossary, making a concordance, making a confluence, making an index, associating those with our other projections onto various abstract structures that reflect knowledge, context, meaning, transliteration, and shades of meaning, and through various lenses and all these kinds of things, in kind of an optical sense, in a diagrammatic sense particularly. That it goes on that of these analytical strata, the structuralist one of codes frequently provokes the most admiration. The lexias in this understanding serve as codemes, the appendices as backup tabular notes and data sources, and the brief expositions as elucidations and essayistic extensions of the codes. Here, codes are various things, and so an encoding is a reduction of a signal of information into codes, which can be reconstructed to the values of those, or sometimes it's as of the epitome of something or its essence. A code is like a tag with respect to otherwise, referring to an index and being an encoding. That a usual language of signal information that's in the digital formal language of letters of a formal alphabet in what results words as above it a grammar and this and that, have it that a book is a code, a text is a code, a sentence is a code. Anything's a code in the sense of that it's variously, in some senses, provably most simple or most familiar or most obvious or most compressed, or something like the Morse code, based on the fact that the English language's usual usage in words has that the letter E is the most commonly appearing word, or word's letter, has that as the shortest code in Morse code, which is a language of dashes and dots, and very brief pauses between sequences of dashes and dots, which spell out each of the letters of the alphabet as via a code. Thus, it is possible to code the verb, these codes, the texts, in this sense, these things. And so he describes that the lexias here serve as codemes. And so we think of usually eames, like lexemes or this or that, are pieces of codes. Having defined each code once, Barthes rather obviously plays with the codes from the outset. He uses them yet subverts them. It's a case of double writing. Having defined each code once, Barthes redefines them to suggest their function. From Barthes, there will be no other codes throughout the story but these 5, and each and every lexia will fall under one of these 5 codes. Let us sum them up in order of their appearance without trying to put them in any order of importance. Under the hermeneutic code, we list the various formal terms by which an enigma can be distinguished, suggested, formulated, held in suspense, and finally disclosed. So he's establishing that it's a sort of rhetorical storytelling, and there's a surprise he wishes to convey, or what was the enigma, vis-a-vis otherwise what we consider a more straightforward or direct sort of fundamental effort or precise statement in a signal. Under the hermeneutic code, we list the various formal terms by which an enigma can be distinguished, suggested, formulated, held in suspense, and finally disclosed. The terms will not always occur, they will often be repeated, they will not appear in any fixed order. As for the seams, we merely indicate them without, in other words, trying either to link them to a character or a place or an object, or to arrange them in some order so they form a single thematic grouping. We allow them the instability, the dispersion characteristic of motes of dust, flickers of meaning. Moreover, we shall refrain from structuring the symbolic grouping. This is a place for multivalence and for reversibility. The main task is always to demonstrate that this field can be entered from any number of points, thereby making depth and secrecy problematic. Actions, terms of the proeretic code, can fall into various sequences, which should be indicated merely by listing them, since the proeretic sequence is never more than the result of an artifice of reading. Lastly, the cultural codes are references to a science or a body of knowledge, and drawing attention to them, we merely indicate the type of knowledge, physical, physiological, medical, psychological, literary, historical, etc., referred to without going so far as to construct or reconstruct the culture they express. Well, that'll be interesting to read some more about Barthes, because I'm trying to work up some more understanding of the natural language understanding. And when getting into this natural language understanding and the various roles of it, and that for me it's just to get a point across. It's meant to be both full and convey as it invades. Whereas for some people it's necessary to speak to two audiences at once and for them to get different meanings. This is where sometimes for some people it's pragmatic or their will or voluntary submission or what it may be, that they need to encrypt something in their codes, and it's not necessarily so for those whose goal is not so necessarily to convey two different things, but just to convey one thing and an open-endedness for everything else, that it's a universal history of man, or universal history of humankind, as it were, of sorts. So this other book is, I really enjoyed it. I picked it up today, Essays in the Rhetoric of Philosophy, and it says, what might be the consequences for philosophy if its texts were exposed to the kinds of reading made possible by recent developments in literary criticism? Well, it's to be said that it doesn't mean much. They're about the same. It's not so different. I mean, isn't that already the same? There's not much to be said. But he goes on to say that there's a very strong defense of poesie from 1595. Such was Sir Philip Sidney's polite rejoinder to Plato in his defense of poesie. Poetry offers an idealized counterpart and hence a morally improving alternative to the drab realities of everyday practical experience. That's just because when you're writing for information, you still write for pleasure, because when you write something for information, you still want to be able to be readable for pleasure. And for some people that involves at least a little bit of work, and for others it's that there's easy outs or that it's generous, and then for others it's that it's clear. It varies. Poetry is seen as an emotive use of language as opposed to the cognitive or referential uses available to science. And it is here precisely, according to Richards, I.A. Richards' Science and Poetry, 1925, that its unique and irreplaceable value lies. Poetry can save us by preserving a region of subjectively authenticated truth immune to the encroachments of scientific method and a neutral, dehumanized worldview which goes along with it. I disagree with that. I like my science and my scientific method, and it's a rather integral part of my literary criticism, in that I suspend my belief, hopefully consciously and conscientiously, and I enjoy it, because I'm going to walk away from the reading it, not the having it fill my head. Same goes for a movie or anything else or any other sensory input. I already have a head. Richards thus stands directly in line of apologists for poetry, descending from Sir Philip Sidney. Well, poetry doesn't need an apology. Improper usage demands correction in a work that expects proper usage. And when that's scientific, then it's scientific, and when it's technical, it's technical. Poetry does not need a defense. Their favored poetic devices of irony, paradox, ambiguity, etc. represented a full-scale alternative program to the scientist view of language as a logical or referential medium. Meh. The literary critic could claim a special competence in recognizing structures of meaning and value invisible to the straight man, philosopher, or scientist. Or make them up. That's one great thing about being a literary critic. It's what do you want it to mean? But the case remained, in one sense, what it had been when Plato expelled the poets from his ideal republic. Oh, here he refers to an event where there are a bunch of lyrical people engaging in poetry, and some imaginably profound, and others very poor. That Plato, to expel them, simply said that this is a wonderful, magical, imaginary place where reason rules. Literary language is still the determinant other of science and philosophy. Well, it's a metaphor. So anyways, there was a good quote in here a few pages in. Talks about Kierkegaard, about the point of view for my work as an author, and Kierkegaard, Terry Eagleton. Terry Eagleton mounts the most articulate attack in a chapter from his book on Walter Benjamin. Deconstruction must be understood as an ideology of left reformism, reproducing at the level of elaborate textual theory those conditions of collusive failure and despair imposed upon the modern liberal academic. Well, see, I don't necessarily agree that deconstructionism must necessarily be a modern, and here it has in quotes, liberal academic, because that's the same thing. I accept that everybody else has the freedom to believe what they want, and that they may be correct, and I wouldn't know it, and I'd rather not. Eagleton argues a forceful case. By pressing semiosis to its full potential, by reading at once with and against the grain of a text that denigrates its deep wounding with all the cheerful plausibility of a West Point war casualty, we can know a kind of liberation from the terrorism meaning without having for a moment, how could we, burst through it to an outside world that could only be one more metaphysical delusion. I don't really care to share that suffering. This polemic occurs in the context of an argument expressly intended to rescue Benjamin's writings for the purpose of a Marxist materialist criticism. I have a materialist criticism. It's not Marxist. My own chapter on Benjamin contests what it sees as Eagleton's reductive views of deconstruction and its bearing on certain crucial ambiguities in Benjamin's work. J. Livingston Lowe's The Road to Xanadu is a baggy monster of a book and in many ways a curiously hybrid production. It mixes an obsessive tenacity of scholarship with a dream of recreating the romantic experience, most often through fictions, I imagine that's a typographical error, and exemplary parables of its own half-conscious engendering. Deeply suspicious of idealist metaphysics and working for the most part with a crude associationist psychology, Lowe's yet strives to articulate a kind of transcendent, unifying vision, somehow vouchsafed to poet and critic alike. In the process, his arguments self-deconstruct into all manner of interpretive pretexts and devices, allegories of reading, as Demand would call them. He offers a particularly rich example of the roundabout ploys to which thought may be reduced in its efforts to achieve a pure self-authenticating access to meaning and truth. Yeah, I'm for that. That sounds like the reading is a journey, and take it or leave it, and take of it what you will and leave of it what you want. It has become almost a ritual gesture among writers on deconstruction to insist that what they are doing is in no sense a species of conceptual exegesis or analysis. This is that our anti-Plato is Wittgenstein already, and if Cirlot is like Holm, who's kind of like Wittgenstein, who's kind of like our anti-Plato. These are our highly esteemed technical philosophers who already know who Plato is and about Platonic ideals. They're refusing, not rejecting, in a sense. So just like that, deconstruction is always subject to its own attack. That doesn't leave it weak because it always invites its own criticism. And they go any number of ways, and in many cases, in an academic setting where it's free to explore these kinds of things, and in fact it's encouraged to help people gain an open mind and to explore how to get an open mind. That is kind of a thing. Deconstruction is first and last a textual activity of putting into question of the root metaphysical prejudice which posits self-identical concepts outside and above the disseminating play of language. Well, that sounds like Platonism. To treat it as amenable to handy definition is to foster a misleadingly reductive account of the activity and hence to render one's text redundant as it originates. There's nothing wrong with redundant when it's in the sense that it's factual, it's matter of fact. I mean, it's everyone values their time, to be sure. One hopes. And there's not necessarily anything wrong with that. On the other hand, such purist attitudes can all too easily become an excuse for mere conceptual laziness and muddled thinking. Deconstruction has a rigor of its own, no matter how resistant to any kind of summary description. No exercise is more widespread today, writes Derrida in Of Grammatology, than one should be able to formalize its rules. Just how such a formalization might be achieved is not so clear in the immediate context of Derrida's remark. It would hardly work out as a set of logical precepts or protocols, such as might gain assent from philosophers of an analytic mind. Though here it's that there's analytical axiomalist natural deduction, and from it arises a geometry, from it arises a logic, from it arises the ordinary and the extraordinary, the three kinds of regular, three kinds of continuity, as what so follows after time and space and chance, statistics as what makes after uncertainty and chance and the random and the probabilistic, the scientific method is fair and available to all, and very deconstructive in the setting where it's also deconstructive. It is structure. However you care to break it down, it is structure. In such a way I can have a simple formalism for deconstruction without much attachment. Deconstructionist rigor, if we are to use that term, belongs to a discourse which can only question all standard regulative notions of logical consistency. For example, there is any paradox, there are none. Isn't that challenging logical consistency? Doesn't then bring the challenges, and then you must have logical consistency to everything. Wittgenstein is our anti-Plato. Nevertheless, it is hard to do without such terms as used to distinguish, say, a text like Of Grammatology from other looser applications of deconstructionist thinking. This is not to argue an absolute difference of kinds between genuine or philosophical deconstruction and its merely derivative or literary offshoots. Well, this pleases me that there's a sort of notion of deconstruction as a technical deconstruction for philosophy. And he goes on, such distinctions as I argue in my methodological postscript are based on a certain policing of textual regimes, subordinating literature to philosophy in a gesture which Derrida is quick to deconstruct. Yet there is, I would claim, a demonstrable rigor at work within certain exemplary texts of deconstruction, a cogency which need not be invisible to those whose analytical presuppositions dispose them to reject or ignore it. The scandal of deconstruction, simply put, is its habit of uncovering a disjunct relationship between logic and language, the order of concepts, and the order of signification. It's a long way to the top, especially from the bottom. This can seem nothing short of scandalous to philosophers whose primary business is the straightening out of our conceptual endeavors through close and rigorous attention to the workings of language. Yet it is here precisely, as these chapters argue, that philosophy comes up against the problems implicit in its own status as written or textual discourse. Such problems are not the particular province of deconstruction to be shunned aside by analytic philosophers in the name of good sense and reason. They are equally apparent in texts like those of Wittgenstein, Austin, and Ryle, or Wittgenstein, Austin and Ryle, which programmatically work to exclude or marginalize their relevance. I stress this point partly to forestall the objection that these chapters treat a mainstream analytic or linguistic philosophy from an angle wholly eccentric to its major concerns. In fact, one could argue that recent developments on the analytic front have thrown up problems very similar to those essayed in the text of deconstruction. Indeed. One example can be seen in the attempt of philosophers like Quine to purge their discourse of all dependence on mentalist or a priori concepts and categories. For Quine, this amounts to a vigorously anti-metaphysical program, a thoroughgoing pragmatism determined to break with traditional epistemology. Hence the attack in his well-known essay, Two Dogmas of Empiricism, on the Kantian distinction between analytic and synthetic propositions, a doctrine which, according to Quine, fails to take account of the constantly changing relation between experienced knowledge and seeming self-evidence. Here it's been as framed as a discussion about the strong metonymy, and about theory is ultimate and theory is infraconsistent, and the void is dual, the universal is dual, and those two is duals, that the one is its parts or its pieces, or that the atom is grain of continuum mechanics, or the atom is the grain of the mesoscale, and this sort of thing in terms of the quantum mechanics, that it's a continuum mechanics. That this is also in a system which basically has worked its way out of what were some of these other very difficult conceptual difficulties of the continuum analysis, and some of these contradictions and the rough sorts of this analytic regime that fails after Gödel to be consistent and complete. It's above that, in a sense, from getting around that there are no paradoxes. And if there were, that would be the paradox that there are none in this kind of thing. It's not Zen. Zen is just an introduction. That is Zen. The totality of knowledge at any given time is pictured by Quine as a kind of man-made fabric. Here he equates knowledge with a limited man's, limited times representation. That's fine. And it's perfectly subjective. But objectively, there's greater and less. There's all and none. The totality of knowledge at any given time is pictured by Quine as a kind of man-made fabric. I don't know if he's really reading Quine generously there, or if he pictures Quine as a finitist or something. The edges having contact with experience, while the center is made up of what presently count as necessary a priori truths. Well, he just said that Quine rejected such. His point is that changes on the periphery, major shifts of empirical knowledge, can always bring about a complex readjustment of truth conditions at the center. Well, it kind of depends what you have at the center. I mean, for some people, they have at the center food and other usual Maslow's hierarchy type needs. But other people, they have at the center reason, or a conscientious approaches to reason, and that never moves, regardless of how the suspension of disbelief in the world is modified by the revealing of fact or perception. His point is that changes on the periphery, major shifts of empirical knowledge, can always bring about a complex readjustment of truth conditions at the center. Logical interconnections demand that reevaluation of some statements entails reevaluation of others, but the logical rules themselves are only statements within the total system, and subject also to constant revision as boundary conditions change. That sounds scientific. See Chapter 7 for further discussion of Quine's views and their place in current analytical philosophy. I would not want to press too far with a comparison between Derrida and Quine. The object of Quine's endeavors is a form of philosophical behaviorism intended to liberate thought from its reliance on outworn epistemological fictions. The behaviorist basis of Quine's empiricism comes across clearly in the following statements from his essay Things and Their Place in Theories. Quine: our talk of external things, our very notion of things, is just a conceptual apparatus that helps us to foresee and control the triggering of our sensory receptors in the light of previous triggering of our sensory receptors. The triggering first and last is all we have to go on. So here we don't have to read Quine, or for that matter other empiricists, as for their accounts of reason, leaving out the essential. Instead, they can just be read as instructions about how to reason in a rigorous way that they will in turn accept. Or for example, anybody who follows our school will accept. That's a different thing than saying there's no others, although sometimes it's so explicitly so. But it's taken from the truths that most of the time things are presented as acceptable, that you can take it or leave it. Then that if you do, it's so described after axiomatics how things follow, that then if you're not to take it or leave it, it's up to you to so relate that to things that all the way makes sense. All the way makes sense. Or not. So most of the time somebody who's able to come up with a philosophy, an argument, is as more objective than usually what the discourse is. That this is what they decided and chose to bring as a gift. and this is for notions of positive thinking, not, for example, terms of rhetoric that are intended to simply convey the emotions or to convey the fears of Einstein, or the pleasures of Einstein, that are simply as so acrimonious as deceit or invection. That which convinces by rhetoric. So the deconstruction in this book about the deconstruction in the essays and the rhetoric of philosophy, it goes on that Quine's epistemological skepticism goes along with a sturdy pragmatist assumption that talk links up, at least for practical purposes, with objects and events in the world outside. What he wants to bring out is the variety of possible links and the pointlessness of trying to combine them to a priori schemes of conceptual validity. Quine's empiricist program could scarcely be more remote from Derrida's ceaseless undermining of any assured link between sign and referent. Nevertheless, it is clear that Quine, like Derrida, perceives a covert metaphysics at work in traditional ways of conceiving philosophy, also that he shares the deconstructionist will to demystify language by removing the appeal to some ultimate ground of concept or meaning, is Derrida. Derrida's critique of logocentric assumptions is not, after all, so far removed from Quine's insistent refusal to entertain talk of meaning outside a particular context-governed instance of sense. Let's see then. Yeah, I'll as much as anybody on the deconstructivist scale is thinking about structuralism, which whereas anybody on the structuralist scale is in some sense in the structuralists, has that this deconstruction is pretty particular and it's so varied that allows everybody to have their own. And so it's very, very difficult to then portray that there can be a monism and that for anybody can have the same one, their own. But it is. And so that's why when we talk about monism and the great value of mathematics and logic and that there's a structuralism and that there's a determinism for it, that we can still read Wittgenstein and appreciate his books and appreciate that his anti-Platonic rejection is as much as his gift to those who need a someone along with them in their thus rejection, with that otherwise they see the entire world as structural, and so defining them that it's a gift for free will and this kind of thing. So let's see here. I got this and that and the other thing. This theory of reduced things is pretty good. The dawn of Tantra. Now that will get into Zen. Dzogchen, that gets into Zen. This and that and more on the others. Well, I suppose that's a good reading for today. And so after Cirlot is what we've been reading, then this deconstructive criticism. And then what I've got is, I got a book of Einstein and some other things I'm going to read. And I have a big stack of Feynman here that for my quantum mechanics and my relativity, and these are of course very structuralist things because in the empirical they're what's called physics and natural science, and that it's warmly valued, the deconstructionist for literary deconstruction's sake, because it's reading for pleasure, in a sense. It is reading for reading's sake, and it is participation in the text as writing the dance. So there's nothing wrong with that. And it's all matters of abstract criticism and being critical, a critical theory of criticism and critique is as of the abstract. And it's conscientious and conscious in this sense. So it's useful to help relate deconstruction and deconstructive techniques and methodologies, even for the literary, as simply helping people think things over and think around them, and not letting things think them over. Well, have a great day, and thanks go to J.E. Cirlot and his Dictionary of Symbols. So long.